12 women over 10 years, the same city, the same neighborhoods, the same type of victim, again and again. And not one missing persons bulletin made the evening news. Not one reward poster went up on a telephone pole. Not one detective was pulled off another case to work theirs. Not one police commander held a press conference and said a killer was out there targeting these women, because the system had already made a decision. It never voted on it. Nobody signed a memo. No captain stood up in a briefing room and said these women don't matter. The decision was made the way most silent decisions get made, through inaction, through underfunding, through the quiet arithmetic of which cases get followed up and which ones go into a drawer, never to be opened again. These women had names. They had mothers. Some of them had children who grew up without knowing what happened to their mothers. Some of them had jobs before circumstances stripped everything away. Some of them were addicted. Some were in survival mode, doing what they had to do to get through the week. All of them were human beings, and the machine that was supposed to find their killer decided, before the evidence was cold, that their cases were not worth the same level of urgency as someone else's. I want you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a story about one monster. One monster is actually the easier story to tell. Monsters can be locked away. The harder story, the one that actually matters, is the story of institutional failure. The story of how a system built to protect people quietly decides which people it actually protects. The story of a pattern that repeated itself across American cities for decades. That is what this case is about. That is what I am going to walk you through today. Not entertainment, not a checklist of crimes. The full picture of what happened, who these women were, and why it was allowed to go on. My name is Marcus Cole. I spent 28 years in law enforcement, 12 with the NYPD, and 16 with the Chicago Unsolved Homicides Task Force. I have worked cases most people never heard about, precisely because the victims were the kind of people the news cycle doesn't pause for. I am not here to sensationalize. I am not here to do murder tourism. I am here because the names I'm about to say deserve to be remembered, and the failures I'm about to describe deserve to be understood by as many people as possible. If this kind of work matters to you, if you believe that the truth about how these cases get handled is something people need to know, subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, because this is the conversation that rarely gets had in places like this, by people who actually worked inside the system. Now let me tell you about the women. In the Pacific Northwest, starting in the early 1980s, young women began disappearing from the Strip along Pacific Highway South in the Seattle area. The highway was known locally as the SeaTac Strip. It was a corridor of cheap motels, truck stops, and the kind of transactional desperation that comes with extreme poverty and limited choices. The women working that strip were not there because it was a decision they made freely with full options in front of them. They were there because the options had run out, because systems that should have caught them earlier had failed them first. Linda Jane Rule was 18 years old. She had been in and out of trouble with the law, the way young people without safety nets end up in trouble with the law. She was from Edmonds, Washington. She disappeared in September of 1982. Deborah Lynn Bonner was 23 years old. She was from Burien, Washington. She had family. She had people who knew her face, who knew her laugh, who noticed when she was gone. She disappeared in July of 1982. Marsha Faye Chapman was 31 years old. She had three children who grew up asking questions that nobody in any official capacity felt enough urgency to fully answer for over 20 years. Cynthia Jean Hines was 17 years old. 17 years old. She disappeared in August of 1982. She had her whole life in front of her. These were not abstractions. These were not case file numbers. These were girls and women with entire futures that were stolen from them by the same hands over and over, while the apparatus of law enforcement in King County moved at a pace that, in retrospect, can only be described as criminally indifferent. The man who killed them, and dozens more, was Gary Leon Ridgway. He was not a shadowy stranger from out of town. He worked at a truck painting company in Renton, Washington. He drove a pickup truck. He attended church regularly. He was married multiple times. He was by every surface measure an unremarkable man living an unremarkable life in the suburbs of Seattle. He killed his first confirmed victim in 1982. He was not arrested until 2001. That is 19 years. 19 years of active predation, 49 confirmed victims, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Possibly more victims whose remains were never found. Now move forward in time. Different city, same pattern, same failure. Cleveland, Ohio. The city's Imperial Avenue neighborhood sits in the Mount Pleasant area on the east side of the city. It is a working-class district that has seen decades of industrial decline as manufacturing jobs evaporated through the 1970s and 1980s. By the 2000s, it was marked by unemployment, poverty, and the kind of social fracture that comes when communities are left behind by every level of government: city, county, state, and federal. Houses on the block had been abandoned. Services had been cut. The people who remained were the ones who couldn't afford to leave. Anthony Sowell lived at 11205 Imperial Avenue. He was a registered sex offender. He had been convicted in 1990 of attempted rape and served 15 years in prison. When he was released, he was placed back into the community, monitored, or supposedly monitored, by the Ohio Sex Offender Registration System. He had a violent record that was public information. His neighbors knew who he was, and the smell coming from his property had been reported multiple times to multiple authorities: LaShonda Long, Tashana Culver, Talacia Fortson, Sonja Silvers, Crystal Dozier, Imelda Hunter, Nancy Cobbs, Shantira Sabrina Carmichael, Janice Webb, Kim Yvette Smith, Michelle Mason. 11 women. Their bodies were found in and around Sowell's property in October of 2009, when a woman named LaTundra Billups escaped from his house and went to police with visible injuries. The bodies had been there for years. Some were in the crawl space beneath the house. Some were in the yard. Some were wrapped in garbage bags and buried under debris in the backyard. The house at 11205 Imperial Avenue had become a burial ground, in plain sight in a residential neighborhood. The neighbors had smelled something for years. Some had complained about it formally. Sowell himself told anyone who asked that there was a dead dog under the porch. It was a convenient lie for a neighborhood already habituated to neglect, already conditioned to expect that their concerns would not be taken seriously by city authorities. So most believed him or felt powerless to push harder. When your neighborhood has been asking for basic services for years and not getting them, the threshold for expecting an official response becomes very low. Women had reported Sowell to police before the bodies were found in 2009. That is the fact that should be on every front page. At least 2 women came forward before October 2009 and said, "This man attacked me, this man assaulted me." Their reports were not aggressively pursued. One woman who reported being raped by Sowell in 2008 had her case fall apart when a key administrative follow-through step wasn't completed. Another woman's account was handled with skepticism instead of urgency. These were women with histories of addiction, with records of involvement in the street economy, and the system looked at them and quietly made its informal calculation. This is the part I need you to stay with. This is not an accident. This is a pattern. In both of these cases, Gary Ridgway in Seattle and Anthony Sowell in Cleveland, there were reports. There were witnesses. There were women who came forward and said something is wrong. Someone hurt me. Someone is dangerous. And in both cases, the investigative response was measurably, documentably less than what would have been applied if the victims had come from different economic backgrounds, different neighborhoods, different social circumstances. Criminologist Stephen Eggert coined a term for this dynamic in the 1980s. He called it the less dead phenomenon. The concept is exactly what it sounds like. In practical terms, it describes the reality that serial predators who target marginalized victims, homeless individuals, people involved in the street economy, people struggling with addiction, runaways, operate in what Eggert called a void of investigators. The victims, having already been socially marginalized, become even less visible in death. They are the lled. They were barely counted among the living in official terms, and so their deaths register with the same institutional indifference their lives receive. This is not a fringe academic theory. It has been validated over and over again by the actual investigative timelines of dozens of serial murder cases across the United States. The Highway Serial Killings Investigation by the FBI, launched in 2004, identified over 700 potential victims of highway predators over a span of decades. The majority of those victims were women in vulnerable circumstances whose cases had been treated individually, in isolation, by separate jurisdictions, with no one connecting the pattern. In the Ridgway case, a task force was assembled relatively early, but it was scaled back in the mid-1980s due to budgetary pressure and quiet skepticism from some officials about the scope of what they were actually dealing with. Multiple senior investigators who worked the Green River case have gone on record saying that the victims' backgrounds made it difficult to generate sustained political will to keep resources allocated. When the victims are young women from the highway strip, when their families aren't connected to anyone at City Hall, when they don't have advocates who can generate media pressure, the case competes for funding and attention against other priorities, and it loses. The families kept showing up. They kept calling. The mother of one victim called the task force so many times that the detectives knew her voice. She was not wrong to call. She was right to call. The problem was that the system she was calling into was not resourced or politically motivated to respond with the urgency her daughter deserved. In Cleveland, the Sowell case revealed a breakdown across multiple systems simultaneously. The sex offender monitoring apparatus failed. The police response to assault reports failed. The city's response to neighborhood complaints about conditions at the property failed. And running through all of it was the same invisible thread. The victims were Black women from an economically devastated neighborhood, many of them struggling with addiction or involvement in activities that made official skepticism the default posture. A review commissioned by the city of Cleveland following Sowell's arrest found that the police department's handling of complaints before 2009 reflected systemic gaps in how sexual assault claims from vulnerable populations were processed and prioritized. The review used careful bureaucratic language, but what it described, stripped of that language, was a system that did not treat these women as credible, as deserving of the full weight of investigative response. Here is something I want to be precise about, because I spent nearly 3 decades working inside this world, and I am not going to be imprecise about it. When I talk about systemic failure, I am not saying that every individual officer involved was corrupt or malicious. Some were, but most institutional failure of this kind does not require malice. It requires something more mundane, and in many ways more insidious and more dangerous. A shared unspoken understanding of which victims matter and which ones don't. It gets transmitted informally in how cases get talked about in roll call, in the tone a supervising detective uses when briefing a missing persons case, in how overtime gets allocated at the end of a shift, in whether a detective follows up with the victim's family after an initial report or considers the file adequately handled with a single phone call logged and a box checked. I saw this dynamic at work in Chicago. Cases where the victim was a middle-class professional from the North Side generated a different level of institutional energy than cases where the victim was a woman from Inglewood or Austin with a drug arrest in her record. The detectives working those cases weren't necessarily bad people. Most of them went into law enforcement for legitimate reasons, but they were operating inside a system that gave them signals, implicit, unwritten, but completely consistent, about which cases will be watched, which ones the commander would ask about on Monday morning, and which ones wouldn't come up unless someone pushed. Gary Ridgway was finally caught in 2001 because DNA technology had advanced to the point where biological samples collected from the earliest victims, nearly 2 decades earlier, could be reanalyzed using techniques that did not exist when those women were killed. A sample collected from a victim's body in 1982 was matched to Ridgway through CODIS, the National DNA Database. He was arrested in November 2001. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to 49 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, agreeing to cooperate in revealing the locations of undiscovered remains in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He is currently serving life without parole at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. What I want you to hear in that sequence of events is this. It took a scientific tool catching up to the case, not the investigation accelerating, not a more aggressive response to the witness accounts and tips that existed, not a political decision by King County or the state of Washington to treat these missing women with the same urgency given to other missing persons cases. What ended it after 19 years was technology that automated the identification that investigators have failed to make through 19 years of manual investigation. The technology saved us from admitting what the investigation had failed to do. Anthony Sowell was caught because LaTundra Billups escaped, because she got out of that house with injuries visible enough that the officers who responded could not dismiss them. When there was a living survivor standing in front of them with evidence on her body, the calculus changed. When it was women who had disappeared, women who had, from the system's perspective, been marginal before they vanished and were now simply absent, the response was slower, quieter, and ultimately catastrophic for 11 human beings. Sowell was convicted in 2011 on 11 counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. He died on death row in July 2021 from a brain tumor. He faced no accountability hearing, no formal reckoning for the years of missed opportunities that allowed him to continue killing. The women he killed never got that accountability hearing either. LaShonda Long, Tashana Culver, Talacia Fortson, Sonja Silvers, Crystal Dozier, Imelda Hunter, Nancy Cobbs, Chantira Sabrina Carmichael, Janice Webb, Kim Yvette Smith, Michelle Mason. I am going to say their names again because in most of the coverage of this case, they appear as a paragraph-length list after the killer's name and conviction count. They were not a list. Crystal Dozier was 35 years old. She had been struggling, yes, but she was 35 years old, and she had people who loved her. Kim Yvette Smith was 44. She had a history that the system used to discount her account when she needed to be heard. Michelle Mason was 45. She had a family who noticed she was gone, who reported it, who called and were told someone would follow up. The follow-up came when her body was found in the backyard. Let me tell you what I think has to change. I'll be direct, because I have earned the right to be direct on this, and because vague language on this subject is itself a form of failure. First, the missing persons reporting system in the United States needs to classify vulnerability as a factor that increases urgency, not decreases it. When a missing persons report is filed for a homeless individual, for someone known to have a substance abuse issue, for someone working in the street economy, that profile should trigger heightened initial response, not reduced response. The research is unambiguous. Serial predators specifically target vulnerable populations because they know the system is slow to respond to those reports. Every time the system confirms that slowness, it is actively enabling the next predator. Second, law enforcement agencies need enforceable review mechanisms for assault reports involving vulnerable victims. In the Sowell case, reports that should have been treated as serious criminal complaints fell through procedural gaps that no one was required to close. There needs to be mandatory supervisor sign-off, required follow-up timelines, and accountability metrics for these cases, not optional best practice recommendations, requirements with consequences for non-compliance. Third, and this is the one that most people who have worked inside law enforcement are reluctant to say clearly. The informal culture of case prioritization has to be named and confronted directly. You cannot fix what you are unwilling to identify. Training on implicit bias is valuable, but it is insufficient if supervisors are not actively and visibly disrupting the informal hierarchy of whose cases get followed up with genuine urgency versus whose cases get the minimum paperwork. The culture is transmitted through behavior, through what gets asked about on Monday morning, through what generates praise and what gets ignored. Change the incentive structure or the culture does not change. 28 years, New York and Chicago. Cases that were solved and cases that weren't. And the single most consistent variable I observed across the unsolved cases, particularly those where a predator operated for years before anyone connected a pattern, was that the victims were people the system had already written off while they were alive. That is the fact that keeps me up, not the monsters. The monsters are comprehensible. What keeps me up is the machinery, the daily, bureaucratic, institutional process by which some people are quietly determined to be worth less. Not loudly, not with intent, but with effect. Before I close, I want to ask you something directly. Somewhere right now, there is a name the news forgot. A woman who disappeared from a neighborhood like the ones I've described today. A case file sitting in a regional law enforcement database that hasn't had active investigative attention in years. A family that made the phone calls, filed the reports, was told someone would get back to them, and never heard anything that mattered. Whose name do you think deserves to be remembered? Drop it in the comments below. I read every one of them. This community reads them. And sometimes a name spoken in enough places, in front of enough people, enough times, becomes impossible for official channels to continue ignoring. That is not a small thing. That is not nothing. That is what kept some of these cases from going completely cold. People who refused to let the names disappear, who kept saying them out loud long after the institutional interest had moved on to other things. Linda Jane Rule, Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marsha Faye Chapman, Cynthia Jean Hines, Crystal Dozier, Kim Yvette Smith, Michelle Mason, LaShonda Long, Tashana Culver, Talacia Fortson, Imelda Hunter. They were here. They mattered. They had names before they had case numbers. And the only honest thing we can do now, the only thing that means anything, is make sure what happened to them and what failed them is understood clearly enough and widely enough that it cannot keep happening without consequence. My name is Marcus Cole. I'll see you in the next one.